Welcome to Crossroads. There's been a bizarre string of incidents around the Paris Olympics. This stretches from drug-using athletes to now drug-laced hamburgers and now global conspiracies. Now this began as doping accusations against Chinese swimmers. Then it began to focus on the long history of the Chinese Communist Party actually using drugs and even forcing athletes to use drugs in order to win these games. And now the Chinese Communist Party has come out with its own counter-narrative. The culprit, according to the CCP, is hamburgers. And the CCP is pushing a broader conspiracy of tainted food, like hamburgers, from the West, carrying drugs that are making their athletes test positive for drugs. Now, the bizarre string of incidents is now bringing attention also to Chinese labs conducting the tests, notably for the doping scandals, whether these are reliable, and ironically, even tying into domestic scandals in China with all this. Now, look, I think it's fair to say, for a lot of Americans, we view the Olympics as more just kind of a game, let's be honest. But it also has a lot to do with national pride. For some countries in particular, beating America and their international rivals, it's like a sign of national power for them. And, for them, of course, it has a lot of deeper meaning. And this is even more so for many totalitarian regimes, which also sometimes lead to scandals and controversies because they are desperate to look good on the international stage. There was the Nazi Olympics in 1936. There was the Olympic assassination in 1972. There was the Bloody Olympics in Beijing in 2008. In Paris now, well, there's been a few scandals. People weren't too happy, notably, about the weird opening ceremonies. But in terms of law and international focus, the big scandal with the Olympics this year have been the ongoing investigations into the doping of Chinese athletes, allegedly taking drugs to help them win more medals. Now, to start, what's now happening is that Chinese athletes are yet again testing positive for performance-enhancing drugs. And this finding is again bringing up concerns that were voiced even before this, going back to the Olympics in 2021, actually. And basically what happened, Chinese athletes were found in fairly large numbers to have been using performance-enhancing drugs, and that was in the 2021 Tokyo Olympics. The CCP's own anti-doping agency, they wrote it off, and one of the main anti-doping agencies in the West, they just accepted the results. And so the CCP's, athletes, they were able to keep their medals. They were allowed to get away with it. And now people were warning about it. They said you have to do something now or it's going to affect the next time. It's reemerging. And it's bringing controversy as we speak, not just against the Chinese team, but also on the organizations tied to the anti-doping investigations. And also to an extent, even to the Olympics committee. Here's what AP had to say just recently. They said another Chinese doping allegation has flared up at the Paris Games, angering some swimmers who say officials need to enforce drug testing rules consistently. They say the New York Times reported Tuesday that two top Chinese swimmers, including one of this year's Olympic team, tested positive for a banned steroid in 2022, but were eventually cleared to compete by Chinese officials. Further, when they state this is the third incident reported over the last several months by the Times and others in which the Chinese have blamed food contamination for positive drug tests. They're saying our athletes are not taking performance-enhancing drugs. It's in the food and they're just eating it. They say the World Anti-Doping Agency accepted the results of the Chinese investigations. And that's leading to a whole other problem. Like that last note on the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, is important because they're becoming one of the main focal points on the U.S. side. And again, some of the controversy goes back to the 2021 Tokyo Olympics. Here's a bit on that. UK Independent said swimming has been rocked in 2024 after the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, and its handling of positive test results from China's swim team before the Tokyo Olympics in 2021. And notes the story, reported by the New York Times and German news organization ARD, surrounds 23 Chinese swimmers, 11 of whom will compete at the Paris Olympics, again leading up to this. And notes they tested positive for the heart medication trimetazidine during a training camp 7 months out from the Tokyo Olympics in 2021. And it notes the scandal is spilt over to the Paris Games. The Chinese swimmers upset at the tricks played by their rivals. In fact, they're actually saying that testing them for drugs is a form of trying to rig the games in favor of the West. It notes further in that crucially, the results only came to light this year, with the China Anti-Doping Agency, China DA, claiming that the swimmers unintentionally ingested the substance because of contamination. It says there have been accusations that some national associations have performed cover-ups, countered with fake news replies by China. And while there is anger after the doping agency cleared the Chinese swimmers but banned Russian figure skater Kamila Valieva, who also claimed contamination with TMZ before competing at the Beijing 2022 Winter Games. Now, briefly, on the CCP side, they claim they've investigated the drug scandal. They're now saying it was caused by athletes, again, eating contaminated meat. And then on contaminated hamburgers, which is, of course, pointing fingers at the U.S. But we'll get more into that in just a bit. First off, on the side of the investigations, WADA, this big organization, they said in a release that many of the news reports were misleading. Here's what they said on their end. Now, WADA states, quote, following some misleading and potentially defamatory media coverage this week, the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, which is based in Canada, by the way, wishes to provide more information in relation to a group of 23 Chinese swimmers who tested positive for trimetazidine TMZ in 2021. They note that WADA was notified in June 2021 of the decision by the China Anti-Doping Agency, China DA, to accept that the swimmers had tested positive in early 2021 for TMZ after they say inadvertently being exposed to the substance through contamination. They say during this review process, which spans several weeks, scientists and external legal counsel thoroughly put the contamination theory presented by China DA to the test. It was not possible, they say, for WADA scientists or investigators to conduct their inquiries on the ground in China, given the extreme restrictions in place due to the COVID-related lockdown. And that's important because that means that essentially they had to take the CCP's word as it was. And of course, listening to the CCP when it's one of the ones being blamed with this scandal, that's causing whole other issues. But they state, WADA ultimately concluded that it was not in a position to disprove the possibility that contamination was the source of TMZ, and it was compatible with the analytical data on file. WADA also concluded that, given the specific circumstances of the asserted contamination, the athletes would be held to have no fault or negligence. As such, and based on the advice of external counsel, WADA considered that an appeal was not warranted. So in other words, the issue with WADA is that essentially they took the CCP's word. They, again, went by the research of the CCP and just affirmed that without being able to actually access China to investigate it themselves. Now, that response they have doesn't appear to be going well. In fact, that's becoming the main focal point of a lot of controversy even within the U.S. government. A bipartisan congressional committee called for the Justice Department to investigate WADA now, which notably received some U.S. funding, and Congress is also possibly taking some actions of its own. Now, members of the House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the U.S. and CCP called on the DOJ and IOC to launch a formal inquiry into WADA's decision to allow Chinese swimmers to participate in the 2021 Olympics after testing positive for illegal substances. Here's what their statement said. They said ahead of the 2021 Tokyo Olympics, 23 Chinese swimmers tested positive for a prohibited substance, trimetazidine, but continued to swim after the Chinese Anti-Doping Agency delayed reporting these samples and the World Anti-Doping Agency refused to intervene. They say despite U.S. and global anti-doping officials presenting strong evidence to WADA, officials neglected to open an independent review at that time. They note that curiously, WADA also received $2 million in excess funds from the Chinese government that year. Some of the Chinese swimmers who were doping proceeded to medal in events, calling into question the validity of the Olympic Games and the credibility of the International Olympic Committee. They note further in, it is imperative for the International Olympic Committee to hold WADA accountable and ensure Chinese athletes who test positive for prohibited substances are not allowed to compete. Now, Look, it's not fully confirmed whether the Justice Department is actually launching an investigation, but there have been some off-record allegations claiming that this is in fact happening. NPR said the U.S. Justice Department has opened a criminal probe into a sports doping scandal involving nearly 24 elite Chinese swimmers. They say the Justice Department, which rarely comments on ongoing investigations, told NPR in a statement that the FBI does not confirm nor deny the existence of an investigation. But, they say, 2 international sports organizations have confirmed to NPR that a criminal probe is underway. Now, those reports, they didn't go along very well with WADA. They came back with this statement. WADA said, quote, "The World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, is disappointed to learn that the U.S. Department of Justice is now investigating the 2021 contamination case of 23 swimmers in China." They say at this time, WADA has not received any contact or request from U.S. law enforcement, but they say the public reports about this investigation validate the concerns expressed broadly by the international community about the passage of the Rodchenkov Act, under which the United States purports to exercise extraterritorial criminal jurisdiction over participants in the global anti-doping system. They note that WADA reviewed the Chinese swimmer case, filed diligently, consulted with scientific and legal experts, and ultimately determined that it was in no position to challenge the contamination scenario, such that an appeal was not warranted. And again, going back to their previous statement, they again said that they basically were not able to access China. They weren't able to get in. You also had the COVID outbreak happening, and CCP had lockdowns in place. And so they went on the word of the CCP investigators, it seems. But they say, guided by science and expert consultations, we stand by that good faith determination in the face of the incomplete and misleading news reports on which this investigation appears to be based. Now, officials with the International Olympic Committee itself have also been drawn into this, because you might remember Congress actually pointed to them and said that they need to intervene. Now, the International Olympic Committee is trying to stop the U.S. investigations into WADA. They're going the other way, and this whole incident itself by extension. And they're also threatening to not allow the 2034 Winter Games to be held in Salt Lake City if the investigations continue. It could also threaten, notably, the 2028 Summer Games, which are also supposed to be held in the United States. NPR said in a shocking move on Wednesday, the International Olympic Committee moved to crush U.S. inquiries into a Chinese sports doping scandal by threatening to reject Salt Lake City's bid to host the Winter Games in 2034. They said in a series of fierce statements coordinated by IOC President Thomas Bach, top IOC committee members blasted U.S. officials for opening probes into the handling of the China case by the World Anti-Doping Agency. And notes that an IOC committee member from Belgium said a probe by the U.S. Congress and a criminal investigation launched by the U.S. Department of Justice, quote, are extremely worrying and basically for us, unacceptable. They say in an unprecedented move, the IOC demanded that officials in Utah, along with the U.S. and Paralympic Committee, USOPC, sign a contract affirming respect for the authority of WADA in exchange for Wednesday's agreement to hold the 2034 Winter Games in Salt Lake City. They note that if the U.S. does not comply by accepting WADA's authority, Salt Lake City's status as a host city could be revoked. But they say many American athletes say they don't trust WADA's procedures and want the probes to continue. Now look, even the Chinese Communist Party is now stepping in. And here's where the allegations of the tainted hamburgers come into play. And the CCP is pushing a broader conspiracy of tainted food, basically pointing at the West, but the hamburgers making their athletes test positive for drugs. Let's first go into these allegations of the tainted hamburgers. The New York Times, they say 2 elite Chinese swimmers, including one named to her country's team in the Paris Olympics, tested positive in 2022 for a banned drug, but were secretly cleared of doping last year by Chinese authorities, according to 2 people with direct knowledge of the matter. They say after a lengthy investigation into the previously undisclosed incident, the Chinese authorities were unable to determine exactly how the swimmers ingested the drug, a powerful anabolic steroid, but concluded that they had most likely done so unwittingly when they ate hamburgers at a restaurant in Beijing. The Chinese emphasized in their explanation to global anti-doping regulators that only trace amounts of the steroid have been detected, and said that those levels were consistent with contamination, not doping. The decision to clear the swimmers was at least the third time in recent years that China has blamed contaminated food for positive tests by top swimmers, an explanation that has drawn skepticism from many anti-doping experts. And they say critics see the incident as the latest in a pattern of China's looking the other way when confronted with positive tests in its swimming program, and as a failure by global anti-doping agencies to ensure a level playing field for elite athletes. Investigators and at least one expert for the World Anti-Doping Agency, known as WADA, were not convinced of the contamination explanation in the most recent case, one of the people with knowledge of the matter said. But the agency, which is supposed to serve as a backstop when a country's own anti-doping authorities fail to properly police its athletes, chose not to appeal China's decision not to impose bans on the swimmers. Now again, the tainted food argument, it's not technically new. This actually ties to some older alerts going back to 2022. And of course, look, hamburgers are not necessarily like ancient Chinese food. It's a pointing of the finger at the US with that. But back in 2022, here's what they were saying. South China Morning Post. They say the World Anti-Doping Agency has once again warned athletes heading to the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing to, quote, exercise extreme caution when eating meat products in China due to a high likelihood of being contaminated with banned substances. And the timing of that could align with them being alerted by the CCP of this whole scandal and so on, right? Now look, the issue with the CCP's response is that they claim, again, it came from hamburgers in China. And just as a reference on that, that has a connotation of pointing at the United States. But second off, saying it was from a location inside China, again, means that almost no outside investigations are possible. They put up a blockade, in other words, making it so that you can't actually investigate it. You can't disprove it. And so you have a choice. Do you take them at their word or do you not? Now, of course, this is where third-party organizations normally come in, and WADA seems to be standing again by the CCP's determination. WADA said just recently on July 30th, quote, the investigation by the Chinese Anti-Doping Agency included the testing of hundreds of meat samples from various sources, with dozens revealing positive results for metadienonon. The Chinese Anti-Doping Agency also analyzed the athletes' nutritional supplements and conducted hair tests, which were negative. Significantly, they say both the swimmers provided negative doping control samples in the days before and after the single trace positive. Following its investigation, the Chinese Anti-Doping Agency concluded that the 4 cases were most likely linked to meat contamination and in late 2023 closed the case without asserting a violation, with the athletes having remained provisionally suspended throughout that time. And notes that WADA and the relevant international federations all had the opportunity to review the case and, if appropriate, take appeals to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. WADA thoroughly reviewed the cases in early 2024 with all due skepticism and concluded there was no evidence to challenge contaminated meat as the source of the positive tests and therefore decided not to appeal to CAS. It says none of the various other anti-doping organizations appealed either. As WADA has indicated previously, once there is no evidence to contest a no-fault contamination scenario, no anti-doping agency has ever appealed a case to convert a finding of no violation into one of a violation with no fault. However, off the back of these cases, WADA wanted to assess the circumstances, scale the risk of meat contamination, which this drug in China and other countries. It says, as a result, WADA initiated an investigation in early 2024. That is being conducted by WADA's Independent Intelligence and Investigations Department, and given it is ongoing, WADA can make no further comment about that. Now, on this, they're saying basically they're still investigating. They're launching a new investigation. They're noting that not only did they not want to go further with it, but the other anti-doping associations didn't either. And they note, again, that they basically had to take the CCP at its word because they had no evidence to contest it. Because again, the CCP was not letting them research and contest it. And that's the problem. Again, it seems that the issues that the findings are based on are the CCP's own allegations. All the information is based on what the CCP is claiming. And it's not clear how much of an ability other organizations would even have to investigate things within China if the CCP won't let them in, and notably in China where it's illegal to say things that damage the face of the party. But also, due to past issues, US Congress and other authorities, they don't seem to believe WADA either at this point. Now, it's even turning into something of an allegation of a big conspiracy launched by the United States and Europe. The Global Times, one of the main Chinese state-run newspapers, ran this opinion piece titled, "Abusing Doping Tests to Disrupt Chinese Swimming Team, This is a Disgrace." And here's how the CCP's state-run media, one of their main mouthpieces, is framing it. Remember, nothing gets said in Global Times or Xinhua or some of these main ones unless it reflects the CCP's actual statements. They say the abuse of doping tests to disrupt the Olympics reflects the rule-based liberal international order dominated by the US. And they say when US manipulates the rules through relentless and unethical testing to thoroughly disrupt the Chinese team's preparation and training, thereby ensuring a victory, this is a classic example of American hegemony. So, in other words, they're saying that their swimmers tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs. This is true. It's undeniable now. But they're saying that the US and other organizations being concerned about that and testing them is interfering with the Olympics. So the issue is not the fact that their swimmers and others are taking these drugs and claiming that, hey, we took it by accident. The issue is that they're trying to say the US is investigating it. And look, a Chinese Olympic swimmer is also going on this narrative as well. They're saying this whole thing is a European and American plot. The Guardian said, a world record holding Chinese swimmers accused doping testers, not the dopers, but the testers, at the Olympic Games of being part of a European and American plot to unsettle China's team. And note that this individual, Qin Haiyang, who holds the record for the men's 200-meter breaststroke, claimed on social media that the vigorous testing of Chinese athletes at the Paris Games was an attempt to disturb their rhythm. How dare you test them for drugs when they're testing positive for drugs, right? Now, note that China's swimmers have been tested on average 5 to 7 times each in just their first 10 days in France, and at all times of the day and night, the national camp has claimed. And notes that Chin said this proves that the European and American teams feel threatened by their performances of the Chinese team in recent years. And he said some tricks aim to disrupt our preparation rhythm and destroy our psychological defense. But we are not afraid. When you have a clear conscience, you do not fear slander. The team is currently preparing to establish at the established pace, and he says that his teammates and him will resist the pressure and win more medals to silence the skeptics. Again, they're testing positive for drugs, but they're saying that the investigations into that are meant to disrupt them. Now, look, that narrative might not work out so well, because look, the CCP, they tend to do these types of things. They tend to use narratives like this. They meet accusations by launching accusations, including often even accusing the other side of what they themselves are doing. It's not that, hey, you guys are cheating in the games. They say, we're not cheating. You're cheating by accusing us of cheating. And that's how it works, see? They're accusing the other side of what they themselves are doing. But in this case, look, making accusations against Europe and the United States may just incentivize these countries to launch their own investigations to disprove their allegations. But on the CCP side, they're also accompanying these accusations with an offer. They're suggesting that all sides can just drop the allegations, right? Let the whole thing slide. So they'll stop accusing the US of trying to rig the games by saying that the CCP is rigging the games by using performance-enhancing drugs, in other words. Reuters said that a leading anti-doping official from China urged the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, and US anti-doping authorities to end their escalating feud on Tuesday, saying collaboration was the best way to achieve drug-free sport. They say the tensions rose last week when WADA fired back at the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, ONDCP, over a report it sent to the U.S. Congress that threatened to cut funding to the global anti-doping body if sweeping reforms were not immediately undertaken. Now look, as mentioned, the CCP itself may become the focus of this scandal. Because look, when it comes to these anti-doping agencies, the CCP does not let them into the country to investigate. The CCP puts up a blockade, which makes it impossible to find out if, again, issues are taking place. And because that blockade is in place, other people can't do their jobs. They have to then choose, well, do we go on the word of the CCP, or would you just push China out of the games altogether? What do you do in that case? And again, with the CCP, this could potentially tie into top-level corruption and actually even possible human rights abuses in China, because that was the actual allegation coming up back in 2017, even in Chinese media. They were claiming the Chinese Communist Party was forcing its Olympic athletes to take these performance-enhancing drugs. The CCP itself was what was being accused of this. In fact, even the South China Morning Post had it back in 2017. They said a Chinese whistleblower now seeking political asylum in Germany has claimed there was a systematic doping program in China during the 1980s and 1990s across a range of sports. They said in a television interview with German broadcaster ARD, this individual, Shui Yinxian, a 79-year-old doctor, claimed more than 10,000 athletes in different sports were involved in a state-backed doping program. State-backed CCP was doing, in other words. They note the interview with Shui came from the same German investigative team which first made claims of widespread doping in Russia, which ultimately led to the Russian athletics team being banned from the 2016 Olympic Games. And as Shui said, all medals won by Chinese athletes at major international tournaments in the last 2 decades of the 20th century were tainted by doping and should be handed back. And said, quote, in the 1980s and 1990s, Chinese athletes on the national teams made extensive use of doping substances. And this individual added, quote, medals were tainted by doping, gold, silver, and bronze. All international medals won by Chinese athletes at the time should be taken back. And it's this individual, this whistleblower, worked as a doctor with several national Chinese teams from the 1970s, but fled China with her first son after speaking out against doping in 2012, and said she no longer felt safe in her home city in Beijing. She said there must have been more than 10,000 people involved. People in China believed only in doping. Anyone who took doping substances was seen to be defending the honor of the country. And anyone against doping, she said, damaged the country, and anyone who endangered the country now sits in prison. And that's what they were saying was the choice, right? You either take the drugs or you go to prison. Because of course, look, that's how crime normally works. If you get individuals working in a crime ring, everybody has to get their hands dirty or that person is a liability. If a person doesn't get their hands dirty, they will try to stop that person. They'll throw them in prison. They'll do something else to them. Because if they don't go along with it, they can rat everybody else out and get them thrown out too. That's the way this stuff works. And according to this whistleblower, that's what the CCP was doing. Everybody has to take the drugs, and if you don't, you're a threat and you don't support the party. That was the narrative. Now look, with this in mind, it seems U.S. lawmakers are not about to back down on the threats or the pressure, no matter where it's coming from. In fact, this bipartisan group of lawmakers has instead now introduced a bill that would cut funding to the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, unless they make sweeping reforms. Now, the Anti-Doping Agency notably receives around $3.7 million a year from the United States in funding. The Select Committee on the CCP said this. They said they were going to hold a virtual press conference to announce bipartisan legislation to bring accountability and transparency to the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, following the Chinese doping scandal that occurred during the Tokyo Olympics in 2021. They noted that earlier this year, reporting revealed again that 23 top Chinese swimmers tested positive for trimetazidine, a powerful performance-enhancing drug, just months before the Tokyo Olympics in 2021. And instead of opening an investigation into the allegations at the time, they say WADA accepted the Chinese anti-doping agency's conclusion that the doping was unintentional and caused by food contamination, a theory that many anti-doping experts have questioned. They state that nearly half of these Chinese swimmers went on to win medals at the Olympics, including 3 golds. American athletes competed and placed behind the swimmers in many of these. And they state that as the largest global contributor of funds to WADA, American athletes should feel confident in the fairness of global anti-doping policies and enforcement. When the world's top regulator of anti-doping fails to do its job, they say, the Olympic dream is crushed. Now, right now, it's all expanding, right? To the point where the scandals are actually overshadowing the Olympic Games themselves. Not only that, but the case is drawing in governments, it's drawing in law enforcement agencies, anti-doping groups, even the Olympic Committee. Now, look, personally, I'd say the CCP is not a credible source when it comes to investigating itself. You can't rely on the CCP to carry out criminal investigations on itself. The CCP is claiming the whole issue is caused by tainted food in China, and that prevents outside investigations because they say, well, it happened in China from something only we can investigate. And remember also, the CCP is being accused in this case of actually running doping scandals itself, even forcing athletes to take these drugs and punishing them if they refuse to take them. And as for the World Anti-Doping Agency, look, we'll of course see where the investigations go. A key issue, again, is very likely going to be on, whether they're carrying out independent investigations into the doping claims or just whether they're going off the claims of the CCP. It's likely that any alleged CCP influence will also be investigated. Was money involved? Did that have something to do with it? They'll probably look at that. And again, they're in Canada, so the U.S. does have an issue of jurisdiction, but given the relations between Canada and the United States, and given that there is U.S. money involved, I think it's possible the investigations are in fact being carried out. Now look, we'll of course see how these investigations unfold, and I'll of course keep you all updated as it goes forward. Well, everyone, that's all for today. Thank you for joining us. Let me know in the comments what you think about this whole scandal and whether you think there's anything to it. Also, please don't forget to share this episode. Help us get the word out. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.